Okay, so thank you very much. As you asked me, I'm going to try to meet these 45 minutes. I think I can remove my face mask. And I'm going to do with this index, I'm going to present a fundamental problem of the coaching process today, a methodological synthesis, which is the methodology that has been followed in the study and in the analysis of this research, the general objectives of the thesis, a brief synthesis, that is small synthesis of the first part of the thesis, which is the historical framework in which we make a critical analysis of the key thinkers, a synthesis also of the second part of the thesis, which is the theoretical framework, where the systematization of the general theory of coaching, and finally, the resolution. So, what are the problems? Coaching today lacks a thorough definition of the discipline. In other words, there are a myriad definitions. Every institution, every organization, every person, every school has practically its own definition of coaching, and this brings a lot of identity problems. This brings with the fact that there is an eclectic amalgam of every disparate methodologies in relation to coaching, and these, in fact, contradictory each other. Therefore, it's also a serious problem. Add to this the fact that given the problem, many tools, many techniques that are being incorporated into the world of coaching come for completely disparate fields and without a methodological basis or scientific basis, and not even a common philosophical basis. Therefore, as we can see from our point of view, the problem is serious. A binding tradition is not recognized, that it's not clear exactly what the origin is and how this has evolved under the name of coaching, and therefore there is no clear identity as to what it is. And finally, there is a little academic research, and here I want to make a little note. There are some academic journals specialized in coaching. Here I mention 3, which emerged between 2003 and 2004, 46 volumes with 103 issues, taking into account that there is an average of 10 articles per issue. We are talking about 1,000 article writing, in which in only 23 articles mentions some of these problems and only tangentiality and non-attempt to solve them. That's the big picture. This is the fundamental problem that I see in the world of coaching. In order to solve it, the thesis proposed 3 levels of scientific foundations. The first, reference scientific foundation, which I call ante-actio, that it's before the action, and it's susceptible to being discovered in an axiomatic, logical, and deductive way. The second reference scientific foundation, to which I call it post-actio, that is after the action, and therefore susceptible to empirical experimentation, although it is subsumed to the first one. This is a term that I may have to explain and clarify later. And the third reference scientific foundation that I call inaction, which is during the action, that it's in the very exercise of the profession as such. Later on, I will explain what are the points that make up each of these scientific foundations, but first I want to quickly explain the methodological synthesis. The methodological dualism that is assumed in the thesis, the deductive logical axiomatic method for the articulation of the first reference scientific foundation, the methodological individualism, methodological subjectivism, the subsidiary postulate of an empirical nature, which is the one that is made up of the second reference scientific foundation, which includes the personal knowledge coefficients, and also the methodology itself without transfer or without directivity. And we do a historical analysis of the thinkers who have contributed to the emergence of coaching, but closely linked to the theoretical systematization. That is, the historical framework is not an interpretation of history, it's the theoretical analysis of certain thinkers who are critically studied to see how the systematization of the general theory of coaching can be constituted. This is the methodological synthesis in general terms. The objectives, the general objectives, are to establish a definition that really answers the fundamental question of what is the operating method that makes the discipline of coaching as such, because there is, as I have said, no definition of this side process that answers the methodology itself. I'm going to go a little deeper on this later, because when I say none, I mean that non-international organization has been able to articulate in the definition of coaching the methodological foundation that support that definition, which is a serious problem from a scientific point of view. I also intend to establish what are those fundamental guiding principles that can guide the profession and can guide the practice of coaching. Without these principles, what we have seen is that not only in coaching beginning to be inefficient in the practical application of the profession, but it's also doing harm. And this damage has already been registered since 2002 when Berglas, in an article at Harvard, already in some way denounced the damage that certain coaches were causing in the name of coaching, and that to this day has not changed. It continues to happen. Another thing that we intend as a general objective is to describe the competencies and abilities, skills of the coach, but distinctive from any other AIDS process. And I will also return to this later. One can say, well, but this is being done, this has already been done, association work based on competencies. But the truth is that much of what has been described as a competency part of the work of coaching is actually part of many other AIDS processes. It's a mixture because it can even be called integration. Then we will see it in the thesis. Even the proposal we make here also state that the mainstream of coaching also runs into the same problem. Another objective is to describe what are the structures that make the continent, and therefore what the coach has to know how to handle, dominate, and know about. The structures, such as the structure of the relationship, the process, or the conversations, are derived from those principles, from those axioms. They are also categories from which theorems can be derived, and so on. In other words, we are talking about the objective reality that make up the coaching profession, and our goal is to try to describe it, but will also allow us, in addition, to separate it from the field of clinical psychology, psychiatry, mental health, or even many psychotherapeutic processes that are developed to this day. And finally, with all these elements, we will be able to systematize the general theory of coaching. It will be distinguished by an epistemological basis, by a teleological basis, that it's a very clear purpose. It will be distinguished by a specific operational methodology, by a competency approach, by a clear orientation on how the tools have to be, and by the type of result that are achieved in this intervention. We understand, or it's understood, that in this way the professional will be achieve autonomy. There is no general theory of coaching or attempt to establish what are going to present in this thesis, or what I'm presenting in this thesis. So we are going to begin with the synthesis of this historical framework that, I remind you, is not an interpretative analysis of history, but of the thinking of key people who were constituting what is known today as coaching. I'm going to do it in a synthetic way, presenting the contributions and improvement points of each one very quickly, as Florentino told us, knowing that the thesis has been read. The first is the Platonic Socrates. Platonic Socrates gives us the maieutics. And what is maieutics? That capacity or that idea that through a dialogue one is able to catalyze knowledge in another person, or that a person is capable of giving birth or give birth a new knowledge without needing to be taught. This is what Socrates told us. Now, the important points. When we analyze what Socrates was actually doing, we realize that there is an incoherence in his speech. One thing is how he described his methodology, and another thing is what he actually did. And we realize that indeed he used demonstrations, other people's speeches, judgment, and giving orders. That is, he used directive and transfer elements that should be polished. That is, there is an incoherence between what he says and what he does. Another person who made his contribution was Aristotle. In his case, he gave us that primal theory of human action. It's thanks to Aristotle and this primal theory of human action that we can today speak of an axiomatic, logical, and deductive method. That is, we can discover certainties or truth on which a system can be built. Aristotle's points of improvement is that being a primordial theory, it needed development, and it's still under development. In fact, let's say that in some way in the thesis I raise it, although it's part of my doctoral thesis in economic, praxeology, or science of human action, where although it had greater development in the economic field and specifically in the Austrian School of Economics, it is understood that it's capable of being applied in any other field within social science, which is where I place coaching and the discipline of coaching. Another point, let's say, of contribution is what I call in the thesis the movement of the philosophical reflection of existence. I have had to coin this phrase because existentialist philosophers do not agree and there are many differences and fight even between them. But we have studied here Kierkegaard, Jasper, Marcel, Sartre, and what we have discovered is that in reality all of them, even though at first it seems they are denying it, end up taking up those natural principles that were already in Aristotle or Socrates. They recognize them, they work on them: consciousness, freedom, responsibility, commitment, action, coherence, subjectivity. They are all elements that are present in each one of them. And in addition, it allows us to understand that there are two great categories in human being or in reality, the objective and the subjective. And that reality I call continent, the objective part, and content, the subjective part. Then it will allow us to see how that is related in an id relationship or in an id processes. The problem with the movement of the philosophical reflection of existence is that one, that it's known, that it's remain in an ambiguous area, it's incoherence because there are even inconsistencies in their own thoughts, and it's speculative in many aspects of the thought they themselves try to capture. And I attribute this to the fact of not having been able to integrate precisely those two categories of objectivity and subjectivity, and the fact of having thus remained in the philosophical approach that distanced it from the possibility of scientific quality to the approach of existentialist philosophy itself. This is the point of improvement that I see in the thoughts of the movement, and later, as we will see later, I try to solve in some way with my systematization. Another of the contribution points I find in Husserl. Husserl brings us two aspects. One, reinforce the them of eidetic science or the axiomatic logical deductive method. Husserl work on that specifically. And then the other contribution is phenomenology as a method, phenomenology as an unnatural attitude through which, with phenomenological reduction and eidetic reduction, it's possible to find or discover what the essence of thing is from a scientific point of view. Husserl writes it, but what we do in the thesis is to give an operative form to that phenomenology. Let's see. It's a difficult subject. There are many points here, say, critical in relation to Husserl thinking. The first, Husserl is difficult to understand. We all know this because many of his followers don't even agree on what he meant. And Husserl himself criticized those who interpret him in a way in which he does not agree either. So we are before a thinker and a difficult subject. On the other hand, I don't put it here, but we don't have all the Husserl work. There is a lot of unpublished work that has not been published. Therefore, we do not even have the full thought of him, and this then has made difficult to progress in a systematic way in relation to phenomenology. Another key contribution point in the thesis is that of Michael Polanyi. In fact, he is one of the people to whom I dedicate the thesis in memory of Michael Polanyi. Michael Polanyi is the one who offers us the clear distinction between tacit knowledge and technical knowledge. He's one who talk about the nature, structure, and dynamic of the personal coefficient of knowledge. And it's very interesting, everything that we discover in the research, that Michael Polanyi, for example, after 3 years of reflection, came to the conclusion that his epistemological distinction solved the Meno paradox. He then transports us back to Socrates and to maieutics. He is capable, with his theory, of being able to explain why a disciple is likely to find knowledge without the helper giving him that knowledge. We found it in his explanation of the nature, structure, and dynamic of tacit knowledge. Points of improvement. Well, beyond the epistemological explanation of Michael Polanyi, there was no great development or application of this distinction. We know that Michael Polanyi was an outsider, and it's true that he cites a lot and that he has ventured into some areas, such as knowledge management, for example, in the world of organization, but an operational application has not been developed taking this distinction into account explicitly, at least as far as I understand. Another of the people who has made a very interesting and a key contribution, and to whom I also dedicate the thesis in his memory, is Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers gives us the operating method of non-directive. This, we all know, it is key because it is from there where coaching really arises. We are talking about the 50s, not the 70s or 80s or 90s. And this is very important to understand. But there are also some problems with Carl Rogers thinking. From our position, as we put it in the thesis, there is a kind of hangover or reminiscence in Rogers of the empiricist, positivist scientists. I have noticed it in the study I have done of all his work. He failed to clearly delimit this border between the objective and the subjective. Therefore, concepts are mixed, which is what is happening today in the world of coaching. On the one hand, there is the subjectivity of the clients, and on the other hand, there is what I have to do as coach, as responsible. And we do not know how to differentiate where I have to get involved and what I don't have to get into. Then, as this field or this category are not the limit, there are many problems when I come to implementing and developing the discipline. And I think that was what happened, in fact, to the psychotherapy that Carl Rogers proposed. But there is a more serious problem, in fact. Carl Rogers abandoned the concept of non-directivity, and not only because he changed the name, something that is also clearly stated in the thesis, that is, not only is it that he changed the name to call it person-certain psychotherapy, but there is an interview in which he basically regrets having coined non-directivity as such. He says, in fact, if it was me who coined it, as if he had not been, as if he had nothing to do with it, he says, if it was me, I regret having done it. So somehow this theoretical practical incoherence is still present in the proposal that we saw in Socrates as well. And we notice it in Roger also with the analysis that I dedicate to him in the thesis. Another great contribution, and this is already key because we are in the prelude of coaching, is of Tim Galway. Tim Galway, who, by the way, participated in the Carl Rogers workshops. Carl Rogers was a friend of Michael Polanyi. Here is a lot of some connections that are presented in the thesis that I'm not presenting here, but there is an evolution. So Tim Galway, for me, practically instrumentalized this existentialist, humanistic, and phenomenological principle through the inner game technique. And it's the prelude to coaching itself. It is not coaching as such, but it's the prelude. What is the problem with Tim Galway's thinking and his technique? Well, that was not systematized as a methodology. From the approach and the study that I do in this thesis, I managed to show that his technique did not become a methodology as such. And this made Tim Galway spend 45 years preaching his methodology. It remains exactly the same, and there has not been any kind of evolution, either inside or outside the academy, because it precisely lacks that methodology that makes criticism possible and of being able to advance in it. In addition, in a deliberate and conscious way, what Tim Galway does is eliminate the instructor to do in relation to the sport, because it starts in the sport. He removes the instructor to do. He does not tell the player what to do, but he does it replace them with instructor to the conscience. Therefore, there is a deliberate and conscious transfer in the methodology itself, recognized by himself and by his own proposal. And finally, we come to the discipline of Tim Galway, John Whitmore, Graham Alexander, Alan Fine, that what they bring is a slightly more operational structure to the inner game. They took the inner game from the United States, they took it to England, they set up their school, first in the sport world, then in the business world. They asked them to be able to teach this to others, and when they have to teach it, when they have to explain it, they begin to structure the inner game in some way, to give a little structure. It's curious because in the thesis I managed to show that even the work of John Whitmore was nothing more than the application of what Tim Galway had already developed, but with a hint of superior non-directivity. I'm speaking here that is already found in them. They begin to speak of paradigms, foundation, essence, principle, competencies, and even certain procedures. What is the drawback that this author have? Well, they continue to use broad, lax, ambiguous definition of what coaching is. Then they end up renouncing non-directivity. And so I remember that John Whitmore, in fact, I had asked him the question through a former student who is a friend of him about whether he continued to promote non-directivity, and John Whitmore said yes, and Masdowny also, but they quit to the fact that they consider that it's insufficient and it is necessary to include transfer or directives or whatever. Not only they quit, but they end up breaking the golden rule of coaching, literally said by John Whitmore, which is to stay on the client agenda. And in the end, well, somehow they fail to maintain or sustain it. Now, it's important to see that all these thinkers that have been commenting on from Socrates up to here, non-directivity as such, or the principle without transference, has been improving. Whitmore's non-directivity is not the same as Tim Galway's. Tim Galway is not the same as Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers is not the same as Socrates, so to speak. There has been a spontaneous evolution, not delivered by a specific person, but which can be perceived. And what we do in the thesis then is to recognize what are the three great contributions that these thinkers have left us and solve the problems so that it has coherence and can give substance to this discipline. The three great contributions that we see, the first is to have a scientific foundation that accounts for the objective part of the discipline and the relationship, and that we see it in eidetic science and in the axiomatic logical deductive method as the highest science method possible, and from there to be able to discover those principles, those theorems. That is a contribution. The other contribution within all these thinkers is the unrestricted respect of the personal coefficient of knowledge, because they all tried, they did. Socrates did it his way, existentialist philosophy did it his way, Tim Galway did it his way, Carl Rogers did it his way. That is to say, it is present, it is latent, although they have not done it perhaps explicitly or completely explicitly as perhaps we can do it today, which, on the other hand, is normal because many years have passed. And for finally, that operational methodology that relates the two previous points. Because we see a Socrates who, through not knowing relative to his methodology, achieved the catalysis of that component of personal coefficient knowledge, or learning through one's own experience proposed by existentialist philosophy, or through the lateral learning of Tim Galway, or through the golden rule of coaching. That is to say, they all have a way, a method, to be able to get that personal coefficient of knowledge to be catalyzed, to be energized in some way. Well, having said that this is the great contribution, now I'm going to raise the element that make up the scientific foundation that I have mentioned, and that I understand that solve the problems raised and that I was also mentioning previously. The scientific foundation of first reference, therefore, is related to the continent. I repeat, it's the area that the coach must know and master, and it's the objective field on which can we define logically, deductively, how to behave. Not only the analysis of the discipline, but also what are the elements that I must master to maintain a relationship in which I, without transferring knowledge, experience, or judgment, make the another, may advance, may discover, may engender, which is the term that I coined in my thesis. So we do it first by describing three axioms: the axiom of human consciousness, of existence, and intentional action or action. From these axioms, some categories are deduced: causal, teleological, technological, psychological, axiological, economic, relation, organizational, and some principles are even defined. In a way, these principles are not different from what is defined in the axiom and in the categories, but they allow us to better understand and respect a little the tradition in which we find ourselves. Talk about consciousness, freedom, trust, responsibility, commitment, or coherence as guiding principles, as it seems useful to us. Guiding principle, why? Because they will be the ones who are going to determine what the coach can or cannot do, should or should not do, and it's going to become, in the end, normative in some way. Then there is the second reference scientific foundation, what I call post-actio, the one that comes after the action and therefore is susceptible to empirical analysis. And here we find two elements. One, on the one hand, the content, which is specific to the client, which refers to the personal coefficient of knowledge, and the operational methodology. And why I incorporate operational methodology into the second reference scientific foundation? Well, because being operational, I need to operate first to see if the result that I'm going to obtain is as expected or not. Therefore, it requires experimentation. And here appears the description of the nature, structure, and dynamics of tacit knowledge. This is from Michael Polanyi. I tried to add some other elements to it, but it's basically based on Michael Polanyi, and the key epistemological, teleological fundamentals are presented. That is, what is the purpose of coaching, its operational methodology and paradigm. And on this I will stop only at this table to comment on the great difference between coaching, or what coaching intends, within this systematization and what other processes are, including the mainstream of coaching, because they have not yet managed to get out of this paradigm that I call of transference. If we focus on the explicit component, the end requires the transfer. The purpose requires transferring knowledge, and therefore the methodology will be an approach with transfer. And to the paradigm, then, I have given the name of the paradigm of transference. Now, as a complement, and this I want to be clear because many times it's not clear, complementary to this process of AID, which is totally valid, there is another process that is emerging, which is the one that focuses explicitly on the tacit component of human knowledge. And if I want to focus on tacit component of human knowledge, teleology, that is, the purpose will be to get the other to generate, to give birth to knowledge. We can use any term. I use the term engender because in the end, then, it's a contribution that I make in the thesis as the most important quality that tacit knowledge has, the ability to generate new knowledge. The purpose is to engender. The methodology, therefore, requires not transferring, not directing, for the engendering to take place. And this I place within this paradigm complementary to the other that I call of engendering. And here I also want to clarify the relationship between both scientific foundation, the scientific foundation of first reference and that of second reference. I may sound it a bit repetitive, but I think this table clarifies a lot. The scientific foundation of first reference is related, we say, to the continent, and therefore it becomes a guiding principle for the helper, for the coach. The scientific foundation of second reference is related to the content and has to do with the essence of the help. Now notice, the continent is technically articulable. If it weren't, this could never be a discipline or a profession or anything. The continent is technically articulable. The content is tacit inarticulable. But the client discovers the decision he makes and a lot of questions that have to do with the personal that enter into the scientific foundation of the second reference. The continent is a static and permanent target. The content is subjective, is a dynamic, and it's temporary. The continent is universal and common to all human beings. It does not matter the time or the place, but the content is singular and individual, particular to each one. We can analyze the continent from axioms, theorems, and principles. The content are experience, that they are personal experience, they are unique, they cannot be compared. The continent is discovered axiomatically, logically, and deductively. Content is generated by tacit integration. The continent moves in and from certainties. That's why we talk about axioms, theorems, and so on. Content moves from uncertainty. The content is concerned with knowing the what, and the content is concerned with doing the how. And here you can see those two scientific foundations, basically the part that is the absolute responsibility of the domain of the coach to get the other to do their part, which is particular and singular, and in which you, as a coach, do not have to put. Therefore, in order to link those two large categories of continent and content, we have had to resort to the first reference scientific foundation, that is in actio, what I have to do in action, that is during the conversation, during the coaching relationship. Well, here we offer a definition of coaching. I'm not going to read it because it's very long, but I do want to specify. I know that you are laughing, Maria, even if you have the mask. I will specify what is underlined only. The coach refrains from transferring consciously and deliberately, with the margin of error that human beings have, consciously and deliberately, judgment, information, knowledge, and experience. On what? On the natural dynamics that the participation of this personal coefficient of the knowledge of the client that I have in front of me has, not on the continent, which is my speciality and the one that I have to master. I have things to say about the continent, not about the content. Here, I put it in a little more specific to make it clear, that natural dynamic of participation of the personal coefficient within the client's cogito-cogitatum relationship, to be clearer. Later, through the thesis, this is explained, or I try to explain it in as much detail as possible. In addition, we have developed a pyramid of scientific coherence where all this is based. In this pyramid, the two paradigms appears again, and I want to focus here on the point for the following. We see that the last foundation of coaching, or the first, is the epistemological, then the teleological, then the methodological. I have already said it several times. Then the competence approach that allows us to determine what type of tools is likely to be added and used in the coaching relationship. Not just any tool, not just any theory, not just any technique, because what we see today is that practically anything goes to put the level of coaching, and then the kind of result that has to be self-managed has to be a result generated by the client itself. Now, what is that I am most interested in highlighting at this time? That the mainstream of coaching has focused a lot on the competence approach. We can say that associations have their competence, but the problem is that they do not have the basis to define those competencies. What is the demarcating criterion to tell a coach how should he listen, or how should he pay attention, or how should he ask? The interesting thing from my point of view of the contribution of the thesis is that we give support to the power to demarcate what type of competencies and how it should be from the methodology, from the teleology, from the epistemology. And in this way, we will be able to discriminate whether in fact that competence is well-defined or not well-defined, if it is consistent with the approach we are making. Apart from this, we have updated the matrix that at the time I called the creativity urgency matrix. Now I call it the situational knowledge and time matrix. This matrix allows us basically and graphically to see that coaching adds value to society, that it has a place that is, so to speak, an orphan, that could not be covered by other aid processes and therefore come to contribute. But also, if you also notice, to the limit. What this matrix shows is is the limit to mutual intrusion of coaching in other discipline and the other discipline in coaching, because it shows you specifically the place for which I consider the profession has been emerging. In addition, we add the logical, axiological, and legal limits. We specify the competence approach. We present 3 large categories of structural competencies, that of relationship, processes, and conversation. Just to give an example, we are not going to comment on it. Here we have the structure of the process graphically, divided into stages, phases, and presages. This is the one about the conversation that begins with the 3 axioms. Some categories are divided, and then we end with some theorems of coaching as such, which then represent graphically. It can be seen that there is a conversational structure that is dynamic, in which I can have a conversation with a person knowing in the category in which the person moves while I follow him. Something that is very difficult to understand when one asks oneself, if I'm not directive, how do I follow the client without interfering, without adding? If I'm clear about the difference between continent and content, I will perfectly be able to identify in which category the client is at the moment, and I will be able to ask the question always focused in relation to an objective. So, in this sense, we bring this. We also provide the truly unique description of competencies. Why we are talking about 4 meta-competencies? Because I have not taken the trouble to do an exhaustive analysis on the description of each of these meta-competencies. From each of these meta-competencies, a very large branch of specific competencies can be opened that we have not done in this work because we believe that it can be done a posteriori. But yes, look now, I think that with this graph, it will be clear that the great difference between the competencies approach of what is presented as coaching, which is on the right, and what is used in other processes of relationship, including the coaching mainstream, because it's not the same. To listen actively, I insist, this is also used in the mainstream of coaching, than to attend phenomenologically. Being present empathically is not the same as acting a faithful mirror for the client. Communicate subjectively is not the same as communicating objectively. It's not the same to ask powerfully than to ask focused. Within this paradigm placed within the paradigm of I with transference, I'm intervening in that content that I was talking about before. While on the other approach of the 4 meta-competencies, what we are trying to do is that engendering occurs. In addition, we have presented how the tools are oriented to the continent and not to the content. And in this sense, I have here another diagram that helps. The coach is the black arrow. He touched the continent. He touched the black line of the circle, but does not get into the content, allowing in that work with the continent that the result of the content is self-managed by the client within the engendering paradigms. Whereas in traditional aids, the helper gets directly into the content and the result is subordinate. That is the product of this intervention on the content. And one of the aspects, perhaps from my point of view, interesting, but which I'm aware that require a lot of research from now on, is the dynamic of engendering in the coaching relationship itself. I do not intend to show or explain this either, but simply to count the elements. We have the client's cogito cogitatum, that natural attention between the motivus and the circumstance that the client brings as human being, this double attention that Michael Polanyi calls subsidiary consciousness and focal consciousness, which we here call attention 1 and attention 2, and the elements that make up the structure. When the client changes their attention, a shift of the attention occurs within the functional aspect, which begins to stimulate the capacity for integration, because in the end, the personal coefficient of knowledge works through integration. This is what we say. It begins to energize that operation. It facilitates the integration that then produces a change in the phenomenon, in the way of observing, in the way of feeling, in the way of seeing, in whatever way. It produces a change in the phenomenon, which finally leads me to an understanding of the totality of what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing. And that would be the ontological aspect of the diagram. Well, the characteristic of the type of results I already mentioned before when I spoke of the tools oriented to the continent. And finally, comment on the resolution. I think I'm more or less on time. It took 33 minutes. Faced with the lack of the definition, the thesis proposed a definition supported on the one hand in the historical, evolutionary, and spontaneous tradition, and on the other hand in the scientific coherence. That is, the two areas support the definition that is being provided here, and that in some way this double theoretical historical filter allows us to see that it is not capricious. That it is not capricious to give a definition, let's say, taking from the sleep, because what is happening in the world of coaching is that it is the whim of each one, according to how he understands it. Here we are trying to avoid that problem. Faced with the amalgam of disparate methodologies, well, then having scientific foundation where there is a specific operating method, it's understood that it is stripped off that amalgam and it's susceptible to demarcation to be able to analyze what is compatible with this proposal and what is not. Faced with the consumption of tools and theories from other fields, well, the epistemological, teleological, and methodological scientific foundation, if you remember the pyramid that I presented before, allow me to be able to discriminate the tool, to be able to discriminate the theory, whether or not it falls within the paradigm of engendering, as we have said, and also it will become the norm to be able to do so. Faced with the absence of a binding tradition regarding to the origin and the evolution of coaching, it is clear here we have made a synthesis of it and also allow us to separate it from all exciting processes until the moment within the paradigm of extransference. And finally, in the face of the scarce academic research, I consider that this general theory of coaching opens up the possibility of being able to know where we are today and begin to discriminate and really develop the discipline. I sincerely believe that if coaching fails to systematize a general theory, which is what I have tried in this thesis, sooner or later it will gradually disappear, as has happened at other times in history with other disciplines that are very similar. I believe that in this sense we are making a contribution that if it were successful, we will be opening up a field of a truly distinguished process that is different from that existing up to now. Okay, this is all. Thank you.